Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. As always, support the transmission, and the best way you can do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. I do a weekly news analysis and roundup, and we organize off-the-record Zoom calls with supporters only every week or two or three. You can purchase a consult. If you want to chat with me, donate. Do check out my affiliates, and the exclusive sponsor this month is expatmoneysummit.com. I participate basically every year. It's free, expatmoneysummit.com. Just go to the website, throw in your email, and you're registered for the free live stream, which is October 10th to the 12th. I'll be speaking at one of the VIP panels. Doug Casey and a host of others will be talking about internationalization. The focus this year is Latin America, and if you use access code Empire, you'll get 20% off the VIP, which gives you access to the VIP panels, lifetime replay, and other perks. Returning to the podcast it's been about a year and a half. David Murrin, davidmurrin.co.uk. He's a global forecaster, author, speaker, commentator, advisor on national security, military history, geopolitics, and financial markets. He also has an affordable subscription service with his analysis and commentary you might be interested in. Welcome back, David.
Perfect. It's been great to come back. I loved the first time, and here we are again.
Here we are, and like I said, a year and a half ago we spoke. I think it's been too long. I usually try to get guests back, such as yourself, once a year for an annual update. And the global situation, continues on a slow burn towards deterioration. I was listening to some of your other recent podcasts, and you said the news isn't looking good. And so, war, economy, energy tyranny, the cycle of empire. Where are we at?
Well, we're sliding down the greasy slope, and I'm afraid it's hard to be optimistic about the forces at play in the human world, which I think are only getting worse, because we're in an entropic cycle, as I call it. And the key to understand that is I have a theory about this 54-year Kondratiev cycle, which creates high inflationary periods like the peak of 75, and actually its biggest correlation is the structuring of war. But wars are not equal. And I've expanded that theory to one of my hegemonic war cycle theory, which is 108, 112 years. Every two cycles, there's a whopping great pulse of entropy, and humanity goes to war. And you can trace it back to the Spanish being challenged by the French in the Franco-Spanish War. You can chase it back to Britain and the Napoleonic Wars challenging France and making sure that it came out as the world's hegemon. You can chase it back to 1914, where Germany challenged Britain in an attempt to be the world's hegemony. And we are now at the stage where China has engaged the West via its proxies, which are Russia, Iran, and North Korea, to basically win hegemonic power. What's interesting about them is you can sort of tell as you move up the slope into the peak, and our next peak is 2030, you can tell that basically it's going to go bang. But when the starting gun's fired, it can go on a long time before that hegemonic struggle is resolved. It was, 1792 all the way through to 1815 for the Napoleonic War. And it was actually 1914 through to 1945 with a pause in the middle before the new hegemonic structure came to the fore after the Second World War. So I don't think this is a short event. It's only going to escalate, and it's only going to deepen as China's involvement becomes more kinetic. It's already become a key provider of lethal aid to the Russians, which was something people couldn't comprehend in 2022. It's now melded its economies for various reasons in bargain for supplies. It basically gives war material, and it learns war lessons, which it harnesses in its giant industrial base. So we are sliding down that slope. And at the same time, the forces which create exterior entropic interaction are playing on the inside of our economies and societies. And so you're seeing the massive schism in America. You're seeing a schism basically across Europe in various forms, apart from the frontal eastern states of Europe, which are facing the threat of Russia and realize they're in danger, who are beginning to pull together and re-energize themselves to defend themselves. So there are some areas that are behaving differently towards the common threat. But on the whole, life is looking rather slippery.
Before digging further into war per se, something just came to mind. It was one of my questions, my talking points, and you mentioned China and hegemony. And we recently had the UN event, and maybe to use a biblical phrase, the kings of the East, right? Eurasia, East Asia, multipolarity. And there's all this talk of global governance, which I view as a synonym for world government. But at the UN, China has unveiled its global governance initiative, where it seems that its US influence is on its way out at the United Nations, and it seems China's influence is increasing. And so it's almost as if the baton is being handed from the West to the East at these global governance institutions. And China is even talking about creating alternative new Bretton Woods-like institutions. So just, and I think that goes with the trend that you're talking about. Just any thoughts there?
Look, Britain had its own structure in terms of how it ruled as the dominant empire to create Pax Britannia. And the League of Nations came out at the end of the First World War, which was an aspiration of trying to work together to not go to war. It completely failed in the 30s. And then America set in place fundamentally the UN as its instrument of how to manage the world around it, and even to manage its adversaries, China and Russia, by having them on the table at certain times. It is an instrument and construct of the American empire. And so the Chinese, their agenda has been multifaceted, from the overt challenge through industry, economy, and militarization, and the covert challenge through control, using trade mechanisms, showing nefarious enticements amongst politicians. And the UN was one of their key areas they have successfully infiltrated. And that infiltration extends to the WTO, when it helped China spread the pandemic and, deny the fact it was zoonotic on an epic scale. I would say that the UN has been compromised in Gaza in places too. And I would say that the axis of autocracies, I call this China at the center with the spokes of its alliances, has infiltrated the UN, which is why you see Trump pulling away from it, because he sees it as a corrupted organization. And it's easy to look at him and say, you're maverick, you're destructive. But he's right. The UN has been subverted, and it's been subverted to an opposite cause, that the tools of so-called global democracy are now being used against democracy. So I think it won't last. And no, the Chinese don't plan to use the UN as their architecture for Pax China. They'll have a completely different system, and it doesn't involve everyone having a voice. But for now, completing that corruption allows essentially many countries who haven't really comprehended what's happened to be used and tooled in this hegemonic struggle. So it's a battleground. It's not a place of deliverance and peace and justice. And we have to open our eyes to see how it's been subverted against democracy. And there's a very good comment that someone made, and that is that when you want to create a global democratic system, surely you should only let the democracies join it. And there's a lot to be said for that. And we're about to see, I think, other systems. Europe, NATO, obviously, is functioning as a democracy. But in the Pacific, there's a great need that this AUKUS agreement, which is Australia defended by or integrated in an alliance structure with America and Britain, is really about the preservation of Australia as the last bastion of a Chinese expansion. So there was a fight back base like there was in the Pacific War, and how Australia was used to move north. Now, there are other key members to that. There's the Philippines, that actually sit in the strategic chessboard of the South China Sea, and from where American forces can attack all of the Chinese mainland. So that's the critical central squares of the chessboard. There's Japan, there's South Korea, their massive industrial base. So there's need for a Pacific Treaty Organization like NATO in the Pacific, and the two organizations to be melded. Because the one thing that the West needs is, it doesn't need the division that Trump has created through trade tariffs, through America first and screw the allies. We need to be working together to create scale to counter China. And in that respect, it's number one, I would say, prosecution of guilt, that I would say that Trump isn't making America great because he's failing to create a coherence among the alliance network to create scale, which is our greatest mechanism against China. And he has completely missed that point.
And maybe on that note, to turn back to the military dimension, I would reckon it's been since the last time we spoke, it's been relatively quiet on the Eastern Front. Things have just continued again with this sort of slow burn. When you talk about Ukraine, and then of course we've got the Middle East, and now you're referencing China, and then we've got as well in the Americas, rumblings with Venezuela, the warships that the U.S. is sending, and then even here in Mexico, talk of coming after the cartels, which are wreaking havoc. I woke up this morning to a video. There's a Telegram channel called a Blog del Narco. They were burning. They burned someone alive. I mean, it was between criminals, but still, just that it's normal that you can watch videos of people being burned to their death here. But anyways, I'm digressing. Just thoughts on, I follow your X account. You make interesting commentary. You're questioning how prepared is NATO militarily, with stocks of ammunitions and weapons to go up against the East. So where do you feel we're at? What's going to happen with Ukraine and whatnot?
So let's just slice and dice those 4 zones. Let's look at Ukraine. The Ukrainians did an incredible job of hanging on. They've been through a pretty tough year. And they've seen their arms shipments cut, returned. They've seen intelligence cut off, which is far more than intelligence, as in, did you know that so-and-so said, and actually far more battlefield management. It's like turning the lights out. They've had it cut off at times. They've had to endure Trump's delusional attempts at peace before he's finally perhaps worked out in Alaska that he's been manipulated and duped and humiliated, the worst possible version and outcome for a grandiose narcissist. And I think there's a possibility that the reflex control that Putin had over Trump has been broken, judging by some of the moves he's beginning to make. But he needs to put his firm weight behind Ukraine. And I think actually a lot has happened since we last spoke, because before, this process whereby the deep battle in the civilian industrial heartlands of each country wasn't really significant, but it's become increasingly significant because it's taken time for both countries to build an industrial weapons base, to build enough missiles so they can do harm to each other. And the Russians are leading the charge, and they make far more than the Ukrainians. So they're rather loose with their targeting, which I think does them a disservice because they don't focus on key strategic targets. They actually hit civilian populations as if the civilians are going to buckle, which they're not. But the Ukrainians are starting to build their own systems so that when America says you can't shoot at a certain range, they shoot beyond the range. And they've really hit the oil production base, which is reduced by 20%. They've done strategic attacks of 25% of strategic bombers in brilliant drone they have been brilliant. And it must be very painful to be Russia. They're not moving forwards, no hope of advance anymore. No more domination, by glide bombs, all the things that were happening before, very different. So I think what's happened is that they've held on through the hardest time. And actually, Putin has suffered more than he would like to suffer. He's now going through another conscription phase, which shows you how desperate he is. But more importantly, in the period since we last spoke, he has become super dependent on China. Now, there's an irony there, but he wanted to make Russia great. And Russia is now the insignificant party alongside China and completely dependent on them. And so he's made a massive strategic error in terms of wanting independence, and now he has codependence. And it's very interesting that when he went to this great parade that Xi put on, and believe me, it was the wake-up call to the world that China has arrived militarily. And it was a wake-up call before, when the states and the Eurasian boundaries that normally traded together became the second tier of the axis of autocracy. So it was a big moment of, I would say, crystallization of what we've known as there declaring its presence. And it's no coincidence that Putin came back and a week later he made the phrase, "We're at war with NATO." I mean, he didn't just say that. He said it because he was confidently backed by Xi. And then he started to do drone incursions and test the airspace, to which I would say NATO has been somewhat wet in its response, because it's not good enough just to knock them down. What you need to do is put a price and reverse the tables. And I would argue the solution is twofold. One is NATO puts an air sky shield over half of Ukraine to the Dnipro River. It protects the heartland of Ukraine, which now is safe, including its industrialization. It allows Ukraine's air defenses to move forward and make their forward areas even stronger. And every time Putin makes an aggressive move, you'd say, right, we're moving another 100 miles east until we get to the old original borders of Ukraine, and we're going to sit over top of the battlefield and nothing will fly in it. Because we have that capability, even without American fifth generation 22s, Europe can do that. And it, just as the IDF dominated the space over Iran, it would have exactly the same outcome. So I think that's one levered strategy that puts Putin at risk that we should be employing. And the other is all of that frozen in Russian assets, most of them his, by the way, they should also add a piece, which is the first 100's gone, and Ukraine is going to use it to buy weapons against you. And every time you do something, not only we're going to move the border of the Sky Shield east, we're going to take another 50 million of your frozen assets. And we need to put him at risk. But what's so interesting about this Western mindset is we are really timid. It's just, much as we say we'll defend every inch of NATO territory, I'm afraid our intention hasn't demonstrated the reverse of temerity and bold, aggressive response to aggression. So that worries me that his tests are actually coming up very positive for him, and they're finding the NATO response wanting years after the war started. But I don't see progress. I don't see Russia as a beast that's going to suddenly charge across the east on its own, because it would get destroyed by NATO air power. Its submarine forces are much more significantly capable per submarine, but they would be swamped, I think, by a Western response, and the bases out of Murmansk wouldn't operate for very long under air power and airstrike. So I don't see the immediate threat of invasion. But my biggest fear is it wouldn't just be China. It wouldn't just be Russia. It would be China joining Russia on the Eastern Front. And its vision of what it really needs to do is push America out, all the way out to the third island chain. That's all the way past Australia, New Zealand, all the islands in the middle apart from Hawaii. And that, I think, is their strategic vision and the force they're building to do that. That's why AUKUS was built to counter keeping Australia under control. And they've done some fascinating things, like Indonesia has now flipped. So there'll be no wars around Indonesia, because Indonesia is already pro-Chinese. So that's a huge area you can cross out. The biggest battle zone is Japan. It is the Philippines, and to the south, Papua New Guinea, that protects Australia. And there's a good example of their ro-ro ferries are all made to dual standards. So their ro-ro ferries are in effect second-tier logistical landing craft, and they're creating forces that can do that. And my argument is you don't do that unless you plan to use it. Their missile forces are escalating in capability and size, which is the access denial process that keeps America from fighting in that space. And she's becoming bolder. And he also has an economic problem, because he created, I think, a wartime economy after 2020. And that wartime economy is close to the bust moment or go to war moment. So it's all escalating in front of us. And the Iranians, in the meantime, have made a nuclear breakout, and they were stopped in one phase. I would strongly suggest that it was unsuccessful in stopping their ambitions, and their ambitions were multi-tiered, and there are probably 2 facilities where they are now breaking out, but they're so deep they can't be struck, providing a massive challenge to the Israelis as to what to do about that, and a massive, in effect, touch point for the Middle East all over again. It's interesting when you look at the response in the West to what's going on in Gaza. And I should precede my comments by the very obvious statement that war is absolutely horrendous. And, it has always been horrendous and is just as horrendous today. And it assaults all our sensibilities to see it and yet be able to do nothing about it. But we do, to understand how we got there and how we might get out of it, we do have to delve a bit deeper than that's horrible and who's doing it and jump on the first person that's done it. And then there's a couple of sort of areas where I would apply logic, and that is Gaza was run by Hamas. Hamas was was the government of the state. And it was a state-on-state action against Israel, not a terrorist attack. It was a state that attacked, and this is a state-on-state war. And traditionally, in state-on-state wars, you fight the state until the state surrenders. In this case, Hamas is the state, and it hasn't surrendered. So the continuance of that conflict would fit that framework. And normally in war, governments protect their people. But Hamas actually wants its people to die and goes out of its way to make sure they do die, because it then uses that PR coup to go and engender support in the West. And as we've seen, support for a 2 Palestinian state and the view that Israel is a pariah and behaving badly. And Israel hasn't countered that informational war successfully, because if it was committing genocide, as the public phrases claim, hundreds of thousands of people will be killed by Israeli weapons. The whole kill dynamics would be different. There may be war crimes committed by units who do things that are not acceptable, but that is different from genocide versus war crimes. And I think it's a very dangerous example of how Iran has made intentionally Israel the pariah, and to make it, in effect, to gather the Sunnis around them and turn against them. And the West has fallen suit in the liberal spaces and presented more weakness that China and Russia can see, that actually represents internal schisms towards when countries are attacked, how do they respond? And, it's all very well for Trump to say, I want peace. But we know that every other peace effort has been, I would say, subject to his own somewhat failed strategic reasoning. In the case of Putin, I think, had a reflex control over him. In the case of Israel, I think Israel has a reflex control of another sort over Trump. And so he may be looking strong for a moment, but I'm not sure this thing's going to hold together at all. Because you can't tell people to stop fighting if one or two of them don't want to carry on fighting. And for the Israelis, I think it's genuinely understandable that they want to eradicate Hamas. And, so it doesn't pop up again. How they do that is questionable. Are the people left in the rubble the people that they, would fundamentally breed it again? Or are they just actually so nascent, followers of Hamas and fighters that they can't do that? Is a big question. But I have sympathies for them, although I don't have sympathies about their other policies. So I need to balance that. And it's really difficult. But the one thing that I am concerned about is that the Western world, in Europe especially, has actually supported and rewarded Hamas for its actions in the process of recognizing a two-state, which can never be created. It's a dream. And it shows the weakness in Western liberal politics when we face definitive, aggressive, autocratic action with China at the center.
Looking at sort of the chessboard, just what came to mind, you mentioned 2030 and China. And would you say sort of Taiwan would be one of the big marker, the crescendo? So we're moving towards this crescendo of 2030. Do you think that's going to be one of the defining moves on the chessboard? And when do you think that could happen?
Look, I think that the Chinese could go anytime. And in fact, the exercises they conduct used to be a few ships and, a few divisions. And now it's numerous ships and divisions, to the point where an exercise looks like an invasion. And the surprise comes through the translation of exercise becoming real. I think that for Xi's pride and face, recapturing Taiwan is essential to the identity of China's strength. But there is another part of this. Their real strategic goal is to go all the way down to Australia. So, do they start in Taiwan, wait for the Japanese to respond and the Americans, and then, okay, they're on, or do they just go straight there? Because if you do go straight there, you can blockade Taiwan and come back to it one day. So I think we need to be very cognizant that China's aim is not and does not stop at Taiwan. That's their first step. But they may actually take two steps and come back to it first. And they're definitely in a situation where America realizes it can't hold the Pacific Basin. And Hexeth has talked about it, carrier vulnerability, and their bases are very similar structured to actually prior to Pearl Harbor, concentrated in some locations. And so I'm beginning to smell that America has a fallback plan, which is where Greenland, it's where the canal, in the Panama Canal, and the issue over Venezuela is coming to the fore, is because it's saying, okay, well, if we lose the Pacific Basin, we need the equivalent of the Chinese first island chain, and who's in it? And by the way, Venezuela is very hostile. It's linked to our enemies, and we need to bring about change, and we'll start with drugs. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing basically America trying to clear its backyard of all the influences, effectively, that it will fail to counter in a global sense, and it's creating a fallback bastion.
I have to say that makes your analysis perfect logical sense, and maybe to turn towards the global financial system, the economy, and get your thoughts there. The tariffs, the dollarization, gold every day hitting records, and then what the West is trying to do with Bitcoin, the digital, the Bitcoin dollar, stable coins, and digital currencies. What are your thoughts? What's important here?
So, as you know from the previous show and even further back, I've been recommending gold and precious metals to be your core holdings. And we've seen a huge surge, not just in the underlying gold and silver, but also the miners. The miners have created multiplicity of the underlying. I think it's a little overpopulated right now, so it might be a bit locally frothy. But I think this trend, and so we can see a nasty correction to Johnny come latelys. But essentially, this is a multi-year trend that's going to take gold to 10,000 and silver to 100 plus, and change the gold-silver ratio. And so we're in that trend, and this is part of the move. But I don't think that's tomorrow, the next day. I think actually I'm the opposite. All the holdings I've had for years, I sold at the highs, and I'm happy just to wait for the Johnny come latelys to have some pain and then restart the trade. So what are we seeing with gold and silver? It's not just an area that's gone up. I think it's a very good representation. I talked about if you could measure like the hidden forces of entropy that affect geopolitics and the world, our entropy levels are going up and up and up into this 2030 peak. And the best medium in the financial markets that represents those entropy levels is the price of gold. And so gold is physically translating the chaos unfolding around us into that as people vote to put their money into an asset they think is safe. Now, when it comes to Bitcoin, is there a safety factor with Bitcoin? I argue not. Bitcoin is just a function of the liquidity trade of money printing, which has held the US stock market up. And it's exactly the same. It's a subset. It isn't a gold or silver. It isn't safe. It has all sorts of issues as far as I'm concerned. So I view it very much as a similarity to the US stock market. It's held up by the hot air of money printing, but basically when the money printing stops, it will be a liquidity trap. And in the meantime, we've got the dollar, which is in a secular trend. It sits on the cusp of an acceleration. And that acceleration may see a little correction to the highs, but I think we're just going straight to correction. I think the dollar is screwed. And, why do I think it's screwed? Pardon my language, is because the dollar, let's just talk about the empire of America, as we are on an empire podcast. The empire of America is the most sophisticated empire we've seen because it creates and threw a huge dome over a sphere in the world. And inside, it built defense alliances all the way to Japan, South Korea, to Europe. And then its hub, it was the strong arm of those alliances. And then within that, there was a trading sphere, and that trading sphere was the dollarization sphere. And the dollarization sphere meant if you traded in dollars, you gave America huge options to leverage and borrow that no one else had because you were the reserve currency. Great. And you can imagine with a young business, there was a lot of margin of return in the 70s, 80s, 90s. But as mature systems get older, their margins of return get finer and finer and finer. I think we can safely say the day that Trump walked into office, there were very few margins in the American empire's systematic construct. So when he came along and he sowed distrust amongst all his alliances that America wouldn't be there, the defense dome shrunk. The dependence changed. And people thought, well, can I trust them? Are they here? I mean, can Japan trust America? I don't think it can. South Korea trust America? I don't think they can. Can Europe trust America? No, I don't think we can. Yes, he might act, but he might not act. And that means distrust. So that's fear shrunk. So then it comes to, well, I don't know trading the dollar, but actually I don't trust the dollar either. So do I trade in something else? And now the dollarization point is shrunk. And America is very definitely in the red, without doubt. And the beautiful tariffs, are just attacks on the American people. And yes, over 5 or 10 years, you might see substitution and changes. But immediately at the worst time, it's created massive inflation for Americans. And inflation then feeds back into bond prices. And because tariffs have been generating revenues, there has been, no greater surge in bond prices in America because there's a hold. But the period of going sideways is not a base. It's a pause before conflict, and conflict dynamics kick in my opinion, that basically drive rates through the roof as America has to borrow more or tries to borrow more from whom. So don't be in the bonds is my advice. Bonds, are not going to do you, and government bonds are going to do you no favors. If you have a 60-40 pension, strap your nappy on because it's going to be an unpleasant experience. So what do you do with your money? Well, we're moving into, and we are in Europe, in Ukraine, very much so. We're in a wartime economy, as Russia is in a wartime economy. Germany is now mobilizing and, on the journey too. Wartime economies are going to become the way our economies function. And they're rather interesting because they are focused on producing real goods. something that the Western world's forgotten doing. Instead of being a financialized economy, you're talking about a productive economy. And it's, I think, an incredible antidote to this money printing disease to start to turn around and make things. So I think we're on the path to do that. And so in terms of defense industries, some of them like Rheinmetall and BAE Systems are stratospheric and will pause, but the thematic of defense is real. And yet many firms with ESG can't do it. So that's a space I think really demands interest and investment from professionals, which isn't happening at the moment.
And I love how you use the example of the dome shrinking. Any thought as to the aftermath of this situation with the dollar? Does the dollar's sort of sphere of influence just decrease to the Western Hemisphere? And then does the rest of the world, the East, just, we see the Chinese internationalizing their yuan through digital means, through gold. And so you think that's just going to become bifurcated or what might happen?
I think we're in the end stage between bifurcation and kinetic action. So, and we can go back and think of that parade in Beijing as one of those key markers. So the first thing to think about is, where is America on its 5 stages of empire cycle? And then go and look at where was Britain in 1914 and where was Britain in 1940 and 39. And Britain was, in late stage overextension. And it still went tits up and was bust by 1917 and had to basically start transferring its wealth to America in the big swap between empires to stay in the war. That's pretty sobering, that basically relatively healthy financial system like the British Empire that was, yes, in its like declining process, but was still right up there, did that. And it did it by having to transfer its assets and its regions of influence to America, who said, thank you very much. The same thing happened in the Second World War, except for we were tits up, like within 1941, gone. And now we're transferring all our assets to America in this massive transfer that no one really talks about, of cousin empires from one to the other, as we gave them everything to stay in the fight. And America became the armaments industry for the free world and brilliantly became wealthy. So one of the questions is, what have we been doing in Ukraine? What we should have been doing in Ukraine is creating lend-lease in Europe. We should have been lending off our balance sheet. So therefore, when we give them things, they're not on our country's balance sheet. And when they win the war, their resources will pay it back. That's what America did to Britain, built a massive industrial base on the back of it. That's what we should have been doing for 3.5 years in Ukraine. And we've completely missed a trick because our politicians don't study history. So that's really important. So what does this look like? Well, when you're a hegemon and you go to war, your currency takes a proper knock, as Britain did in 1914, and it did even more so in 39. So conflict and moving towards conflict is going to accelerate the dollar's decline. But the sphere of influence is still going to be an allied influence, and the dollar will still be used, so it won't disappear. It'll just decrease in value, and it'll decrease massively compared to gold and silver, which is fixed or a fixed base. So what we're really looking at in that process is this whole idea that it takes one knock after the other. And then the big question is, how do you borrow money when you're already over borrowed to fund your war machine? And I think we're going to see, much as Ukraine has had to do, which was do things on the cheap, which are very clever, we're going to see a whole new level of low-end war fighting capabilities that really use very clever answers when you don't have lots of money. The idea of lots of exquisite weapons, not going to happen. Some exquisite weapons, absolutely, and masses of really clever cheap shit is the other part of the high-low mix. And I think that's a response to being broke. I mean, America is going to be broke going into this war. And, on the good side, there is one great piece of news, and that is the Germans aren't, because their debt to GDP ratio is still 64%. And so they are borrowing to rearm, and they are taking a financial economy in the European system and becoming a productive economy, which is a massive shift. And so there is a shift coming. Sleepy Europe is slowly being woken up by a common enemy. The question is, can it move fast enough? but it is changing, and it has, I would say the bottom has curved, and we are seeing some of those things. And for the first time, Germany is now ruled by a leader that isn't under the control of Putin, because all the others have been. So Germany is an unfettered, independent European country that is behaving in a stronger and stronger way. That's a good thing.
Speaking of the West, one concern I have, you mentioned the autocracies of the East. And for the folks that listen from left to right, the multipolaristas, I don't think that can't be denied. I forgot to mention, I've got new affiliates. One of them is Startmail, which is based in the Netherlands, which I've been using for years. And if people sign up through my link, that I get a commission. They use their service. Startmail is banned in Russia and my former home of Kazakhstan by the ISPs, the governments there forced them to ban those. I had to go through 3 VPNs in Kazakhstan to access my email. So just my question is, I feel what's happening in the West as the economies decline in the West, because I'm a Westerner, we're both Westerners, Europe, US, even here in Mexico and Canada, the economies are declining. Civil unrest is rising. We're in this wartime economy preparing for war, and Western governments, I feel, are also adding to their arsenal autocratic tendencies. So we're seeing this push for digital IDs like with Starmer, all sorts of digital controls. It's almost, people have called it the Chinification of the West. A lot of these social credit technologies now coming back to boomerang, to haunt us. Just have you picked up on that trend?
Absolutely. I mean, what you so aptly describe is a tendency as conflict dynamics increase to move to the right. And that has always been so, because what happens is the system demands protection. It becomes more nationalistic. It becomes more security focused. The rights of the individual get sublimated to the rights of the system. And so this entropy pulse into 2030 manifests itself by everything moves to the right. And, Chinification, technology, social systems, they are migrating across to societies that, and interesting enough, the 2 cases I used, in Britain, we've got a left-facing government. I would call it a neo-Marxist government under Starmer with its policies. They're highly destructive, and yet they are so keen on destroying free speech. Free speech if you want to speak against them. They're happy to free. They want to be free with their leftist ideas, but if you come from the other side, you are not free to speak. That's in the liberal left-facing society. And then you go to Trump, who's happy to criticize Britain and say free speech is disappearing. What are you doing? He creates free speech constraints against his own personality. Hexeth announced whole new structures where the military couldn't speak to the public. The press had to not speak about anything they think they shouldn't speak about. Man, that's pretty interesting. What can I talk about after that? And you're seeing the crushing of free speech with comedians at night who make a joke about Trump. They're fired. So free speech is disappearing on the left and the right. It's more than a political of its time moment. It's actually, I think, this big entropic pulse where systems are moving to autocracy. Even as democracy faces autocracy, it's becoming more like the systems it's facing down. And I'm afraid there is a reality. If you look at, British society in World War I and World War II, it was far more socially constrained than in peacetime. And we don't look back and think, God, you got autocratic, but they had rules to follow because the system was at war and had to optimize itself. So I think we're seeing a replay of that with a particularly, interesting agenda, which is of our time, which is our communication avenues, which are so, numerous, are all being constrained according to thought and behavior. In the past, you just had to write a letter and the letter got censored, and that was the only form of communication you had. But sure enough, letters got censored. And, that was the voice being suppressed. So it is not unique. It's not very pleasant. It's pretty alarming. And I'd prefer that we were conscious as we do this rather than unconscious, because what's really happening is Starmer isn't doing it to protect the state because he sees that we're at war with Russia, which we just happen to be in this shadow conflict, and saying, well, let's make the country safer by changing communication protocols. He's saying, no, you can't think differently from me. If you do, you'll suffer. And Trump's doing exactly the same. That's the alarming part. Losing freedom to to increase collective security is an imperative in conflict dynamics. Losing your freedom to someone who doesn't agree with you and wants to suppress you, that is scary.
It's so alarming. This summer, I went and reread Orwell's 1984 and for the first time watched the movie, which I had not seen up until now. Staring into the abyss. What else am I missing? What are other issues that you think are important to get across?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think everyone should read Animal Farm, and they should see how these animals behaved, because it's happening all around us today. It's a brilliant caricature. And I wrote a piece in my Marinations today, which is called The Entropy of Stupidity. And it explains how, malice can be dealt with in some ways. Stupidity is a disease that is just so entropic. And stupidity starts when we stop taking responsibility for ourselves. We stop thinking, we stop challenging, we stop having a critical pathway to examine difficult issues. We become collectively stupid, and collective stupidity is highly entropic and causes disaster. So we are in that space. And what is our counter to that? It's conversations like this: bold, courageous, open-minded, being prepared to challenge and look objectively, to put aside the prejudice we have. And funny enough for me, I was having a conversation actually a couple of days ago, and they said, what's it like having built these models that are so predictive versus where you were when you started? And they said, but funny enough, I sort of started with pretty much similar political perspectives. But now I can actually say to people, well, I know how people and systems behave in expansion, and I know how systems contract. And so if you're a socialist and you come and tell me that you have socialistic beliefs and the world will be a better place, I will answer and say, well, could you show me where socialism has been successful before, where these values in any empire has actually created a bigger system or contracted it? Because there is no evidence. In fact, very opposite. Socialism and wealth distribution destroy systems. They're not lateral, they're not creative, they're highly linear, they're propagated by people that can't create, so they just take yours and redistribute it, mainly to themselves. So that's not a productive system. I can look at productive systems and say, well, great, where do they run out of steam? So it's given me this really sense of what is constructive in human behavior and what isn't. And I think we're so busy shouting at each side, saying, I'm right, you're wrong, you're red, I'm blue, rather than sitting down with critical thinking, say, let's just examine how these policies worked in history. Oh, not so well. How these policies work. Oh, they were a bit better. And how could we actually make them better? And we don't do that because we're so partisan. And breaking the code of history and the theories subsequently about entropy and human behavior have given me a lens through which I can explain that to people. And I hope it allows them to think and break out of, in effect, the Orwell's paradigm and the entropic paradigm of stupidity, where you're just following the person ahead of you without really thinking about it.
Speaking of stupidity, you made me think of AI. ChatGPT, which is fueling the dumbing down of because people no longer think for themselves. They just go to ChatGPT. They use Google Maps. Do you have any thought on? Well, this is all sort of leading towards transhumanism, which is another topic. But any thought on some of these new technologies of AI?
I mean, my generation was brought up with the Terminator, and I'm afraid it's coming true in front of our eyes, because the most powerful AIs are going to be kill chain AIs that basically have sensor suits and allocate weapon systems to hit targets in the shortest time. And they're going to take people out, because if you have people in, they'll be slower than the competition, and you can rest your bottom dollar. The autocracy powers take them out faster than democracy does, forcing democracy to do similarly. At that stage, we risk quantum computers that have thinking processes that we think are actually very like humans, because our brains are more like to be quantum computers. Now we understand microtubules. And so the net process is we are giving power to AI. We're creating a singularity. And the irony is, a living system, we're doing it to defend against a war. And in the process, we're going to generate another problem that's even bigger. So I think that's a real issue for us. I think ChatGPT is a very interesting one, because in answering the question, I would split the world into the lateral and linear thinking process. So for someone who's quite linear and data string orientated, there's a real problem, because all it does is emulate what they do, and it does it better. So it will shut down their thinking process. But for lateral people, it's a gift, because it allows you to research information and connect that information, which is now far more readily available, into far more complex, bigger solutions. And as a dyslexic, its ability to check words and spell and therefore accelerate output of thought so I can write at the speed I think is the most incredible productive boom. And in fact, I would say it's enhanced my thinking process and horizons, but it's because I'm not using it to think for me. I'm using it to gather data points and then give me more information where I can make more synaptic connections to make a more complicated model. And therein is the problem, is that we now face a time where I think in human evolution, the agrarianism that created linear thinking was necessary to turn a few hunter-gatherers into larger civilizations because we used human batteries as our energy source to counter entropy, slavery, indentured labor. So to move forward, we had to build our population and bulk it out with people that could do menial tasks. And, agrarianism was part of that process. But we're now on the other side of that, where in fact robotics, automation are going to take all the menial tasks physically away, barring very bespoke ones. And at the same time, what we've got in this process is we've got the lateral people having tools that make them even stronger. And so I do think that we've truly seeing a social dynamic that no one's thought about, that essentially, the linear element of humanity is about to lose its utility that it was born for, which was to create mass, which isn't needed in the same way. And those that can think laterally and connect dots have a huge advantage, and AI is going to leverage that advantage because they're fundamentally creative and they'll increase their creativity.
I think that's an extremely important point, how a lot of people use it just linearly to get answers instead of thinking, and as you say, to use it laterally where you can scale up. Well, we've covered a lot. Would you say, besides the 2030 crescendo war and all that, are you optimistic? It sounds like you feel there's hope that a better world is still possible that we can pivot to. And so, any final thoughts for us?
Yeah, look, and it's something which I've written about in my upcoming book when it's finally edited. And that is, I've come to this very profound observation that essentially we are using wars to evolve. And that sounds crazy, but what are we doing when we fight? We are maximizing the forces of adaptation. And the side that least adapts, or is relatively size for size, unable to, loses. And the winner then becomes more adaptable, more lateral. And then even after war ends, all those innovations of who's in charge and mindsets continue for decades afterwards, perpetuating the system forwards. And this pulse I talked about at the beginning, which is this hegemonic cycle, is almost like a stimulus for the whole humanity to go to war in these titanic struggles, find the most adapted lateral organization. They become then the dominant hegemony. We end up with Pax Britannia, Pax America, Pax God knows what's next. And then essentially humanity moves forwards. That's how we've been evolving. But we're at a stage where our conflict might wipe us out because our weapons are so sophisticated. So I've always described this conflict, World War III, that we are now in the foothills of, basically is about consciousness or catastrophe. So what is the pro and con of autocracy, functional autocracy like China, or individuality? I think the most amazing thing that really rings home for me is once we start to think of our minds as quantum computers, our minds can shape the universe around us. And positive thinking has long since been part of a culture, but it really does it, I think, and can be explained by a quantum mechanical interaction. So what happens when some or one or two or three individuals start to really tap into the power of the brain? What does that mean for the society they're in? It could be a total game changer, and it could start with just a few humans who make the jump. And we are going through right now a trial by adaptation. And I think we will evolve as the freer society and the free version because individuality has disproportionate power. We just need to wake up and mobilize ourselves quickly so we might deter, aggression in this last 11th hour. And we need to realize that as individuals, we have much more positive mindsets that bring outcomes to our world. And when we do that collectively, it's quite unbelievable. So yes, times are challenging, but as ever in the conscious and catastrophe paradigm, it's up to us to take the nettle, appreciate what reality is, have the courage to see it, and then adapt and start to create mitigating strategies and grow stronger. And that's what we should be thinking about.
Very good. Some white pills there. Your links, as always, are in the description. If you want to remind people where are the best places to find you, your projects, services, products, and all that, books.
So just wander your way around to davidmurrin.co.uk. It's a website of Global Forecaster, and in it, I strongly recommend you subscribe to Murrination's Gold. There is a silver, but that's one newsletter a week. By gold, you can get more of them. You can see all the previous Murrinations, which are not just out of date. They all explain to you how the world is working, and they rejoin your dots in the way you think of the world. And instead of being constantly surprised by its outcomes, you will actually have a much more predictive expectation of it. That goes home to how you work, your family, the choices you make, and also how you see your politicians. So it's about a wake up through education. And everyone who does join supports it, spreads the word, and it's part of the cascade of change, which I created Global Forecaster for. So I really encourage you, if you've enjoyed our conversation, to actually go and challenge yourself and do that. And for people who manage money and higher levels, so there are whole different levels in the site, as many of the clients are some of the best asset managers in the world. So you're looking at a distillation of that knowledge, which I've tried to bring down to an everyday exposure level. And everything in it has something linked to that ultimate process of what happens next. So please, take the step, and you'll be very welcome. And thank you for having me on your show. It's just a great pleasure being questioned by you.
Well, I look forward to our next conversation. Hopefully we don't wait a year and a half until that.
Thanks,
so thank you.